All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend David Dayen. David is an independent journalist whose work you can find at davedayen.com. You can also find him on Twitter at ddayen. David, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, thanks for having me, Matt.
All right, so David, like I said right before we went on the air, I'm really happy to have you here because honestly, I have a hard time understanding really much of anything that Wall Street does. But last week, the Senate released a report on J.P. Morgan Chase, and what they found was crazy and frightening. So why don't you just tell us all about it?
Sure. So the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which is subcommittee that Carl Levin chairs, which has put together some of the best reports in the post-financial crisis period on banks and their various malfeasance that they have done, whether it's Goldman Sachs and various trades and lying to investors and trading both sides of the same deal, or HSBC and money laundering to Mexican drug cartels and sanctioned governments, rogue states. So this one was about J.P. Morgan Chase. Last year, the world learned that J.P. Morgan Chase lost a bunch of money on a series of trades that were put together in their London office by a guy named Bruno Iskill, who is known as the London Whale. And so colloquially, they were called in the United States the fail whale trades.
Right.
So why is this important? J.P. Morgan Chase lost a bunch of money. It's on them. Who cares? Well, it's important because of the way in which this came about. First of all, the trades that they were engaged in are supposed to be banned by the U.S. government because of their risk. The Volcker Rule, which was part of the Dodd-Frank financial reform, effectively banned large banks that take deposits, commercial banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, from doing proprietary trades. In other words, trading on their own account with depositor funds in this risky fashion. But that's, in fact, what they did. Now, the bank called it what they call a hedge. In other words, it was a trade that was made to, just in case they took losses elsewhere in the system, these were supposed to balance it out. So you hedge your risk by trading a little bit on the other side of a bet. However, they could not identify what the trade was hedging. They claimed that it was sort of a hedge of the entire J.P. Morgan Chase portfolio, but nobody could really identify it. And in the internal documents that the Senate committee called up, they basically mocked the idea that this was a hedge of any kind. So that's number one. Number two, there was depositor money, federally insured depositor money that was being used in the service of this trade, which ended up losing $6 billion, which for J.P. Morgan Chase, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a healthy percentage of their annual profit. And obviously, if this went worse and the trade was, not revealed until it was too late, this could cause a systemic risk. The third major, and really the major problem here, is that J.P. Morgan Chase essentially lied to both investors and regulators about not only the nature of the trade, but the nature of the losses. What the Senate report found is that they basically hid the losses. They used a particular system for calculating the losses that made the losses look smaller, number one. They simply refused to submit reports to their primary regulator, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and in a very amusing moment in the actual hearings on this, none of the top executives who were there to testify could even identify who was responsible for giving the reports in to the primary regulator, and they generally basically hid the idea that this was a problem at all from both investors and the regulatory apparatus. When you hide the nature of the losses, you're basically lying about your financial situation, and that is a form of securities fraud. Lying and hiding the nature of the losses to the regulators is something that should draw regulatory sanction as well. And it begs the question of what else is J.P. Morgan Chase hiding in terms of its balance sheet, and what are they banking on if they actually go insolvent here? Because they seem primarily unconcerned about the risk that they take on, and is sort of in anticipation of the idea that if they get into too much trouble, the U.S. government will bail them out. And in the hearings, John McCain, who's the ranking member of the committee, said that basically J.P. Morgan Chase had a business strategy based on that model, that they were too big to fail, and that they would simply be bailed out if they ran into too much of a problem.
And I think their perception of this is probably accurate, right? I mean, like, if you look just back a couple of weeks ago when Eric Holder said in front of the Senate that he doesn't believe he can prosecute Wall Street, which I don't really buy I don't buy that opinion that he shouldn't be prosecuting Wall Street, but he flat out said that he's not going to.
Yeah, and it's really even more disturbing when you look at the overall history of what J.P. Morgan Chase has been able to do in the last few years, particularly with that perceived prosecutory immunity and that the perceived implicit kind of bailout guarantee. There was a separate report. I find a more damning report, actually.
You wrote about this on Naked Capitalism, right?
The other Capitalism, that was put out by a guy named Josh Rosner, who is a Wall Street analyst for a company called Grant Fisher. And this report really just documented public instances of J.P. Morgan Chase's various settlements and indictments and investigations over the last 3 or 4 years, and it just reads like a rap sheet. The amount of things that they were involved in makes them look like, I believe I labeled it in the report, a vertically integrated criminal enterprise with their hands in just about everything.
Yeah.
And this goes from the LIBOR scandal and mismarking, they're rigging their interest rates, to rigging energy markets, rigging municipal bond markets, making fictitious trades, playing where they actually are the buyer and the seller of the trade, and they actually make money that way. Don't tell me how, but it was a remarkably comprehensive report. And those are really just a very small portion of the kinds of criminal actions that J.P. Morgan Chase has undertaken over the last few years. And it's clear that they knew full well before Eric Holder made that statement that there was no real threat of prosecution. Most of these things are settled through very sweetheart settlements where the offending bank can actually write off a lot of the
fine that they
penalty,
get or whatever.
The penalty on their taxes. So it's this and the whale trade and what we saw in the Senate really just was the capstone on all of this. You had sort of a rogue bank that is far too big to manage. I mean, the CEO and top executives really couldn't understand the deal. that was being made. They couldn't articulate it. The arrogance of a bank dictating to the regulator what information they're going to give them rather than the regulator demanding it was quite illuminating. And it just shows that these banks are really out of control. They're too big to manage, and they need to be broken up, cut down to size, and have their activities strictly monitored, because this is obviously a problem for the overall economy, as we saw in 2008.